He introduced her to the room like she was furniture, not a stranger, not an enemy. Furniture. Something you move out of the way when you want a better view. Kang Taijun stood at the center of the Han River Grand Hotel's main ballroom. 700 guests, crystal chandeliers, the kind of silence that only money can buy. And he pointed to the seat beside him. The seat Zaria Brooks had sat in for 8 years. The seat she had earned. And then he said, without flinching, without looking at her at all, "Yuna will be sitting here tonight." That was it. No explanation, no apology, just a sentence, delivered the way you'd tell a housekeeper to move a chair. If that were you, if you had given nearly a decade of your life, your talent, your nights, and your silence, what would you do in that moment? Would you walk out? Would you scream? Or would you stand there, the way Zaria stood there, with your face perfectly still while something inside you quietly broke in half? She stood still. And that stillness, that terrible dignified stillness, is where this story really begins. If this is your first time here, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, because I promise you, it gets so much worse before it gets better, subscribe and stay with me until the end. The dress had taken her 40 minutes to choose. That was the detail Zaria would remember years later. Not the betrayal itself, not the bracelet, not the moment his rival crossed the floor toward her. Just the 40 minutes she spent in her hotel suite, holding a deep burgundy wrap dress in one hand and a black fitted gown in the other, trying to decide which one made her look like she belonged. She chose the black. She always chose the black at these events. Less attention, cleaner lines. Taejun preferred it when she didn't pull focus. She understood that now. The way she understood it only after, the way you understand a bruise once you finally press on it. The Han River Grand Hotel's charity gala was an annual production. The Black Phoenix Foundation, Taejun's public-facing humanitarian arm, the thing that kept his name in newspaper columns adjacent to the word philanthropist rather than the other words that fit him better, drew every power player in Seoul. Politicians who owed him favors, corporate executives whose balance sheets he quietly controlled, journalists who knew better than to ask the wrong questions, and their wives, their partners, their carefully maintained companions, all of them draped in jewelry and good manners, circling the room like expensive satellites. Zaria had attended 7 of these galas. She had helped organize 4 of them. She had written the keynote remarks for 2. She did not appear in a single photograph from any of them. That was also something she understood only later. She arrived at the ballroom at 7:45, which was exactly when Taejun had told her to arrive. Not too early, not late enough to draw attention. She had learned his preferred rhythms the way you learn the layout of a house you've lived in a long time. Not because anyone explained it, but because bumping into the furniture too many times eventually teaches you where everything is. The room was already thick with people. The foundation had outdone itself. Floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. A string quartet near the east wall playing something classical and forgettable. Servers moving through the crowd with a precision that suggested military training. Everything was immaculate. Everything was exactly the kind of immaculate that Zaria had designed in the planning document she'd submitted to the events team 3 months earlier. She got a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She didn't like champagne at these things. She needed her head clear. She spotted Taejun near the center of the room, already commanding a small orbit of suited men who laughed at the right moments and leaned in when he spoke. He was wearing a charcoal 3-piece that she knew cost more than most architects made in 6 months. His hair was perfect. His posture was the kind of posture that didn't come from confidence. It came from knowing that everyone in the room was watching and deciding to use that fact like a weapon. He was 41 years old and looked 35, and he had the kind of face that made people assume he was smarter than he was, which was its own kind of power. He didn't look at her when she entered the room. That wasn't unusual. At these events, they maintained a professional distance. She was introduced, when she was introduced at all, as a business consultant, not his wife. Not the woman who had spent 7 years designing every legitimate business structure that kept Black Phoenix's criminal revenue from attracting government attention. Just a consultant, a word that meant nothing, a word that kept her safely in the background where Taejun preferred her. She found her assigned seat at the head table, 3rd chair from the left, as it always was, and set her small clutch down on the white linen. A server appeared immediately to fill her water glass. She thanked him. He blinked, slightly surprised, and moved on. People at these tables didn't usually bother with thank yous. She was checking her phone, a text from her assistant about a zoning submission deadline, when she felt the shift in the room. Not a sound, not a commotion. Just that collective realignment of attention that happens when something unexpected walks through a door. She looked up. Eunicio entered the ballroom at the far end, and the room noticed her the way rooms notice beautiful things, with a low, wordless hum of awareness. She was 32, sleek in a way that suggested careful engineering, wearing a pale gold gown that caught the chandelier light with every step. Her hair was pinned back from her face. Her posture was Taejun's posture. Borrowed, practiced, fluent. Zarya knew Yuna, had worked alongside her for 2 years, executive secretary, highly efficient, the kind of woman who remembered every meeting, every preference, every small piece of leverage. Zarya had respected her professionally, had even, in the careful and limited way that Taejun's world permitted, been cordial. She watched Yuna cross the room toward Taejun. She watched him turn, and the expression on his face was not the face he made with subordinates. It was not the face he made with allies. It was the specific, unguarded softness of a man looking at someone he has chosen. Zarya's water glass was very cold in her hand. She watched Taejun take Yuna's hand. Not a professional greeting, the kind of gesture that means something, the kind that, in a room full of people trained to read exactly these signals, communicated everything that needed to be communicated. Then he said something in Yuna's ear, and Yuna smiled, brilliant and entirely satisfied, and they walked together toward the head table, toward the third chair from the left. Taejun stopped in front of Zarya's place setting with the expression of a man who has already decided what he is going to say and is mildly impatient to get it over with. Yuna will be sitting here tonight, he said, quietly, evenly, the way you'd correct a seating chart error. Zarya looked at him. She thought, and this was the thing she was ashamed of later, the smallness of it. She thought he might say something else, an explanation, a context. We need her at the head table for business reasons, you understand. I'll explain later. Something, anything that would make the sentence into something that wasn't exactly what it was. He said nothing else. Yuna was already sliding into the third chair, already unfolding the linen napkin with the ease of someone claiming something that had been promised to them. Zarya picked up her clutch. Her face did not change. She had spent 8 years learning to keep her face still in rooms where it was useful for other people to believe she didn't feel things. Of course, she said. 2 words. Flat and clean and utterly safe. She stepped back from the table. She found an empty stretch of wall near a window that overlooked the river and stood there with her water glass and her still face, and she waited for the feeling to arrive, the real one, the one underneath the stillness. And when it arrived, she recognized it immediately because she'd felt it before, years earlier, in a different city, before she'd learned to perform. It was grief, pure and uncomplicated. The grief of a person who has just received a confirmation they'd been quietly hoping wasn't true. She drank her water. Across the room, Yuna laughed at something Taejun said. It was a beautiful laugh. Zarya noticed that with an almost clinical detachment, the kind of laugh you practice. The evening moved the way these evenings moved. Speeches, applause, the choreographed presentation of large checks to charitable causes. Taejun spoke for 11 minutes about the Foundation's commitment to Seoul's communities. He was good at this, earnest in a way that people who didn't know him well believed completely, and even some who did. Zarya had edited 3 drafts of those remarks. She had pushed him to include the section about youth employment programs. She had cut 2 paragraphs of self-congratulation that would have made the whole thing sound like what it actually was. Standing against her wall, she listened to the applause and felt something closer to nausea than anything else. It was during the reception that followed, that long conversational period between dinner and the formal program's end, where deals got made and alliances got negotiated under the noise of crystal and small talk, that Taejun found her again. He appeared at her elbow without preamble, the way he always did, as if her attention was simply available to him whenever he needed it. You should circulate, he said. There are people here you should talk to. The Hansung Group CEO wants to discuss the Mapo district proposal. She looked at him. You want me to talk business? That's why you're here. She let that land where it landed. The bracelet Yuna is wearing, Zarya said. That's my grandmother's bracelet. A pause. Very brief. The kind that told her everything. You left it in the apartment, he said. I left it in the apartment we share. Zarya. That bracelet was my grandmother's. She gave it to me before she died. It's not a piece of office equipment, Taijun. This isn't the place. You made this the place when you gave her my seat. His jaw shifted. That small particular tightening that she had learned meant he was recalibrating, measuring what was worth engaging with and what was easier to dismiss. He looked at her with the expression he probably believed was patience. We'll talk later, he said. When later? But he was already turning, already absorbed back into the room, and she understood with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that later was the same as never, and it always had been, and she had simply been choosing, for a very long time, not to know that. She stood with her empty water glass. She thought about her grandmother, Clara Brooks, who had worked as a seamstress in Atlanta for 40 years and had saved that bracelet through 2 decades of tight months because she said a woman should have one thing nobody could take from her. Clara, who had pressed Zarya's hands between her palms on a rainy November afternoon 4 years before she died and said, "Baby, you are not furniture. Don't let anyone treat you like furniture." Zarya had not cried at her grandmother's funeral. She hadn't cried in years. She was not going to cry in this ballroom. She was setting down her glass on a server's passing tray when the room shifted again. She didn't understand it at first. That subtle reorientation of attention, people turning, conversations breaking off mid-sentence, a path opening through the crowd the way paths open for very specific kinds of men. She tracked it back to the entrance. Ma Do-hyun. She knew who he was. Anyone who moved in the circles she'd moved in for 8 years knew who he was. White Tiger Organization. Taejun's most significant rival. Not the only one, but the only one who'd held ground against Black Phoenix for going on a decade without losing significant territory. He was 39. He had the kind of reputation that arrived in a room before his name did. She had never met him, had seen photographs. The photographs had not fully done the job. He was moving through the ballroom with the particular ease of someone who understands that attention is a form of power and has decided to treat it as such. Not performing. Just occupying space with a totality that made other people's space occupying look like amateur theater. He wore a dark navy suit, no tie, and he was looking around the room with an expression that was neither aggressive nor warm, just present, observational, like a man taking inventory. Taejun had gone completely still on the other side of the room. Zarya noticed that, noticed it, and filed it. She was watching Do-hyun's slow transit of the ballroom when he stopped, changed direction. She tracked his new trajectory and realized, with a feeling she couldn't immediately name, that it was aimed at her. He crossed the floor with the same unhurried confidence he'd crossed the room with, stopped in front of her with 2 feet of space between them, enough to be respectful, and he looked at her with dark eyes that were doing actual assessment rather than the performed version. "Ms. Brooks," he said. His Korean accent was there, but his English was fluent, and he used it, she noted, with the specific intentionality of someone who has chosen their language carefully for this particular moment. "You know who I am," she said. Not a question. "I know who you are." He didn't elaborate on that yet. "I've been watching this room for 20 minutes. I came here tonight for a specific reason." "What reason?" "This one," he said. And then he extended his hand. Not a handshake, not a business overture, but palm up, open, an invitation. "Would you honor me with this dance?" The string quartet was playing something slow. The floor was half empty. And across the room she could feel, without looking, the way you can feel certain things, Kang Taejun watching. She thought about 40 minutes choosing a dress. She thought about a chair that had been hers. She thought about a bracelet on another woman's wrist. She thought about her grandmother's hands, rough and warm, pressing hers. "You are not furniture." Zarya Brooks looked at the open hand of the man who was, by every structural measure of the world she'd been living in, her husband's most dangerous enemy. She placed her hand in his. The floor opened for them, the way floors open for decisions that cannot be taken back. And she didn't want it taken back, that was the thing. She felt the solidness of that in her chest as they began to move. The solidness of a person who has finally, after a very long time, stopped performing stillness and started choosing direction. She said quietly, so only he could hear, "You didn't come here for a dance." "No," Do-hyun said. "I came here to make sure something was corrected." "What something?" He looked at her steadily. "Your name," he said. "Someone removed it from a place it should have been for a long time. Tonight, I intend to put it back." The music moved around them. 700 people watched. Kang Tae-jun stood at the far end of the room with the expression of a man watching an empire develop a crack he doesn't yet know how to stop. And Zaria Brooks, who had spent 8 years learning to be invisible, to be useful, to be present without taking up space, felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten it was a real thing. She felt dangerous, not violent, not vindictive, the clean, clarifying danger of a woman who has stopped deciding her own worth by someone else's accounting. The dance wasn't long. It didn't need to be. By the time it ended, the room had already understood that something had shifted, even if none of them yet knew the exact shape of what had shifted, or how much of what they believed about Kang Tae-jun and the woman who had stood quietly beside him for years was about to come apart at the seams. Zaria stepped back from Do-hyun's hand with her spine straight and her face, for the first time all evening, showing exactly what she felt. Nothing performed, nothing managed, just a woman who had made a decision and intended to see it through. She looked across the ballroom at her husband. He was already looking at her. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away. Not flinching, not apologizing, simply done. Simply finished with the performance of caring what he saw when he looked at her. Her grandmother's bracelet caught the light on Uniceo's wrist across the room. Zaria thought, I want it back. Not just the bracelet, everything. Every blueprint, every late night, every idea she'd handed him with open hands that he'd taken without once saying the word thank you, as though it were a real word and not just a sound he made when it was useful. All of it. She wanted all of it back. She didn't know yet exactly how she was going to do that. She didn't know about the legal filings that were already drafted, waiting on her attorney's desk. She didn't know about the IP registrations she'd quietly made 2 years earlier on the advice of a lawyer who'd told her, with a specificity that had frightened her at the time, just in case. She didn't know yet what Do-hyun knew, or what he intended to reveal, or how completely the evening was about to incinerate everything Kang Tae-jun believed he had secured. But she knew she was done. And sometimes, knowing you're done is the only thing that matters. The string quartet shifted to something new. The room reabsorbed itself into its own conversations, and Zaria Brooks stood in the ballroom she had helped design, in the gown she had chosen to make herself small, and she let herself, for just a moment, take up exactly as much space as she actually occupied. It was more than she'd allowed herself in a very long time. It was enough to begin. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Zaria finally let her shoulders drop. Just that. Just the shoulders. She wasn't going to give herself more than that. The ride up to the 32nd floor took 90 seconds. She counted them. Old habit. Counting things when the alternative was feeling them. Tae-jun had once called it her robot mode. He'd said it with affection, early on, the kind of affection that later reveals itself to have always been mild contempt wearing a softer mask. The hallway was empty. Pale carpet, recessed lighting, the particular hush of expensive hotels that have been paid to keep the world out. Her keycard was in her clutch. She stood in front of room 3244. The suite Tae-jun had booked for them both. His name on the reservation, his credit account, his choice of corner room because he liked the river view. And she put her hand flat against the door without opening it. She stood like that for almost a minute. Then she opened it and went inside. She sat on the edge of the bed in her black gown and her heels, and she didn't move. The skyline burned orange and silver through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Seoul at night looked like something a person could believe in, from enough distance. Her phone had 17 notifications. She didn't look at them. She was thinking about the bracelet. Not strategically. Not yet. Just the bracelet. Her grandmother's hands fastening it around her wrist the last Christmas they'd had together. The clasp that always stuck a little on the left side. The way the diamonds caught kitchen light differently than chandelier light. Warmer, somehow. Less performative. Claire had worn it to church for 30 years. She'd worn it to Zaria's college graduation. She'd pressed it into Zaria's palm in a hospital room with the specific gravity of a woman who knows she is making a transfer of something that matters. "This is not jewelry," Clara had said. "This is evidence. Evidence that women in this family survived things." Zaria's throat tightened once. She pressed her fingers against her sternum and held the pressure there until it passed. Then she stood up, unzipped her gown, hung it, because she was not the kind of person who threw things on the floor when she was falling apart, and changed into the clothes she traveled in: dark slacks, a simple gray top, flat shoes. She repacked the small overnight bag she'd brought. She did it methodically. Toiletry case first. Then the folder of documents she never traveled without. Force of habit. 7 years of never knowing when Taejun would redirect a trip into a working session. She was closing the bag's zipper when the door opened. Taejun had a key, of course. She hadn't thought about that. Or she had thought about it and decided it didn't matter, which was perhaps the same thing. He came in without knocking, suit jacket off, the top button of his shirt undone, the specific looseness of a man who has spent the last 2 hours controlling a room and is now in a space where he believes he doesn't have to. He looked at her bag on the bed. He looked at her shoes. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes. Tonight." "That was my plan." He closed the door behind him. Not a slam. Taejun didn't slam things. Just a firm, deliberate close that said everything a slam would have said, but with more dignity attached. "We need to talk about what happened downstairs," he said. "I agree. Would you like to start, or should I?" He moved to the window. Classic Taejun positioning. Put the skyline behind you, make the other person look at you against a backdrop that suggests scale. She had watched him do this in 100 meetings and had never once pointed out that she knew exactly what he was doing. "The dance was a mistake," he said. "Dancing with Do-hyun." "Yes, that's what you want to start with. It made you look—" "What did it make me look, Taejun?" He stopped. Recalibrated. She could see it, that small adjustment behind his eyes, the micro-decision about whether to say the actual word he was thinking or find a safer one. "It was a provocation," he said. "Do-hyun came to that gala to provoke me, and you gave him exactly what he wanted. He asked me to dance at an event where my husband put another woman in my seat and then told me to go make small talk with the Hansung CEO while his mistress wore my grandmother's bracelet. She said it cleanly, no heat in it, which she knew was harder to argue with than shouting. Was I supposed to stand at the wall all night? You were supposed to be discreet." Something shifted in her chest. Not pain, something harder than pain. "How long?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. The city glittered behind him. "How long have you been sleeping with her?" Zaria said. "This isn't Taejun, just his name, flat and final as a closed door." He looked at her, and she had known this man for 9 years, had studied his face in meetings and in bed and across dinner tables and in hospital waiting rooms when his father was dying, and she watched him decide right now, in real time, what kind of man he was going to be in this moment. He chose the practical kind. 14 months, he said. 14 months. She did the math without meaning to. 14 months ago, she had been finalizing the first phase designs for the Han River waterfront project. She had been working 18-hour days. She had come home at 2 in the morning more than once to find him already asleep. Had been grateful for that because she needed to be up again at 6. Had told herself the distance between them was temporary, professional, the tax you paid on ambitious work. She had been working while he was building something else entirely. "Okay," she said. He frowned. "Okay. I heard you. That's all you have to say." "What would you like me to say?" He crossed his arms. The frown deepened into something that looked almost like frustration, the specific frustration of a person who has rehearsed a conversation in their head and the other party is not behaving according to the script. "You're not angry," he said. "I'm past angry." "What does that mean?" "It means I used up angry somewhere around month 8, she said. "When I noticed that the financial structures I'd built for the Mapo development weren't being filed under joint ownership. When I asked you about it and you said it was an accounting error, when I found out 6 weeks later it wasn't an accounting error." She picked up her bag. "I think what I'm feeling right now doesn't have a clean word for it." "Put the bag down." "No." "Zaria, put the bag down and sit down and let's have an actual conversation like adults. We're having one. You're walking out. I'm leaving a hotel room. My lawyer will determine the rest." The word lawyer changed the temperature in the room by several degrees. She saw it, the almost imperceptible straightening, the way his arms dropped from crossed to at his sides, a posture shift that said, "Now we are in different territory." "You've spoken to a lawyer," he said. "I have a lawyer. I've always had a lawyer. I'm an architect with an independent company. Of course I have a lawyer." "About us?" "About my intellectual property. It turns out those are related." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, and the performance of reasonableness had dropped a layer. "You don't want to do this," he said. "Taijun, you don't understand what doing this will cost you. Going to war with me. You don't have the infrastructure for that. You don't have the resources. You don't have the connections. And if you go to whatever lawyer you think is going to help you, and you start making noise about intellectual property disputes, you will find out very quickly that every door in this city is closed to a woman who is known as the person who tried to publicly destroy Kong Taijun." He said it with the evenness of a man stating weather patterns. Not a threat. Worse than a threat. A calm statement of what he believed were facts. "I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because I actually don't want to see you hurt." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you know what I did?" she said slowly. 2 years ago, when a lawyer I hired to audit my contracts told me I had serious exposure, I filed IP registrations, quietly, completely legally, on every major design concept and development strategy I'd built since we started working together. She picked up her bag. "I'm not starting a war tonight, Taejun. I just stopped pretending one wasn't already happening." She walked to the door. "The bracelet," she said without turning around. "I want it back. Tell her I want it back." She left. The cab to her office took 22 minutes. She sat in the back seat with her bag on her lap and watched Seoul scroll past the window. The night market still lit, the Han River bridges strung with light, the city doing what cities did, which was continue existing without particularly caring about anyone's specific crisis. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Jung Min Seo, her assistant. 11:40 at night. She answered. "I've been watching the coverage," Min Seo said. She was 26 years old and had the specific emotional range of someone who'd grown up in this city, understanding that the powerful ate the careless. "It's everywhere. The dance, I mean. Someone got photos. It's on 3 different news aggregators already." "Which photos?" "You and Ma Do-hyun, the dance. They're calling it..." A pause that contained something Min Seo was deciding whether to say. "They're calling it a provocation. Some of them are using your name, your actual name, not just Kong's wife, your name." Zarya was quiet. "Ms. Brooks?" "I heard you. Which aggregators?" Min Seo listed them. 2 entertainment-adjacent political outlets and 1 financial news site that had no business covering a charity gala unless someone had fed them a reason to be interested. "The financial site," Zarya said. "What angle are they using?" "They're asking questions about the Han River waterfront project, about the development credit. Someone, they don't say who, gave them a tip that there's a dispute about the originating architectural design." Zarya closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Do-hyun. He hadn't just come to dance. He had come with ammunition and had quietly handed it to people who knew how to fire it. She wasn't angry about that. She wasn't sure what she was about it. Grateful, maybe, with something complicated attached. "Min Seo, yo," she said. "Tomorrow morning I need you to pull the complete registration file for the Han River project design concepts. Everything. The time-stamped originals. And I need Park Attorney's direct line." "Park Jisoo, the IP firm?" "Yes." A pause. "Should I book conference room time?" "Yes, 9 a.m. And Min Seo..." She hesitated. "Thank you for calling tonight." Another pause, softer this time. "Of course." She hung up and looked out the window at the river. "What?" The office was empty at midnight except for the security guard on the ground floor who knew her well enough to just nod. She took the elevator to the 8th floor where Brooks Design Consulting occupied the south wing. Not a large operation, 14 people, intentionally modest, because she had learned early that Taejun preferred the things he controlled to not look like they were worth controlling. She unlocked her own office and sat at her desk without turning on the main lights. Just the desk lamp. The city through the window. Her drawings on the wall. The waterfront rendering she'd been refining for 2 years. The community mixed-use structures. The green corridors along the river. The affordable housing blocks that looked like architecture instead of apology. Her drawings, her handwriting on the margins, her late nights. She pulled out a legal pad and started writing. Not a plan. Not yet. Just a list. Everything she could document. Every email, every meeting note, every design session where she had been the only person in the room who understood what she was building and why. She wrote for 2 hours. At 2:15 in the morning, her phone buzzed. Not a call. A message. Unknown number, but the message itself identified the sender clearly enough. The tip to the financial press was intentional. They'll run a fuller investigation piece tomorrow. There are things coming out that you may not be aware of, things Kong has been doing with your foundation assets for the past 8 months. You should look at your family foundation accounts before the morning. I'm sorry you're learning it this way. MDH, she read it twice. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up the Brooks Family Foundation account portal. A small charitable organization she'd established 3 years ago in her grandmother's name, funded with her own earnings, designed to support architectural education scholarships for young black students studying abroad. She logged in. The account balance was $63,001. It should have been $480,000. She sat very still. The office was completely silent. The city continued below. She clicked through the transaction history. 11 transfers over 8 months, each one routed through an intermediary account she didn't recognize. Each one authorized with her digital signature, her credentials, on dates she was now running back through her memory, dates she was certain she had not been near a computer authorizing financial transfers because she had been on-site in Incheon, or in a design review in Busan, or twice overseas for international development conferences. Her signature. Used without her. Her hands were completely steady on the keyboard. She noticed that distantly. The way you notice things about yourself from a slight remove when the thing happening is too large for immediate processing. She forwarded the transaction log to Park Jisoo's email with a single line. Call me first thing. This is beyond IP now. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the waterfront renderings on her wall. 2 years of work. Every structural decision, every community consultation, every environmental impact adjustment. The project that Tae-jun had been preparing to announce as his company's flagship legitimate development. The project whose design documentation was registered in her name, timestamped 2 years earlier, sitting in a legal filing she had made quietly, carefully, on the advice of a lawyer who'd told her, just in case. Just in case. She thought about Uniceo's satisfied smile as she settled into the third chair from the left. She thought about 14 months. She thought about $480,000 of scholarship money. Money that was supposed to go to kids who looked like her, kids who wanted to build things, and needed someone to believe in that before the world decided whether it was worth believing in. Drained through accounts she'd never seen, signed with a signature she hadn't given. She thought, there is no version of this that ends quietly. And she thought, with a clarity that scared her a little because it felt so clean. Good. Do-hyun's office was on the 44th floor of a building in Gangnam that most people walked past without knowing who occupied the top 6 floors. Zarya had not been there before. She had not, until approximately 8 hours ago, had any reason to be. She arrived at 8:50 a.m. His assistant, a compact, precise man in his 30s who moved like someone trained in 3 different fields simultaneously, showed her in without making her wait, which told her something. Do-hyun had been expecting her. He was standing at his window. Not the same power position as Tae-jun's window standing, no calculated skyline framing. He was just looking at the city with a cup of coffee in both hands, like a man who'd been awake since early and was thinking hard. He turned when she came in. You found the foundation accounts, he said, last night. I should have warned you sooner. I only got the documentation yesterday afternoon. I didn't know how much he'd taken. $480,000. Something moved across his face that she recognized as actual anger, not performed anger. It tightened his jaw briefly, and then he controlled it. Not suppressed it, just controlled it. There was a difference, and she noticed the difference. Sit down, he said. Please. She sat. He remained standing, though he moved away from the window. Toward her, toward the center of the room, which was a different choice than Tae-jun would have made. Why? She said. Not, I understand the legal dimensions. Why did you come to that gala? Why did you make it public? Because it needed to be public, he said. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one. He set his coffee down. I've known about the IP situation for 4 months. I have contacts in the architectural licensing registry. That's not unusual, the development business and the registry overlap. When the Han River project started circulating among investors, I had it looked at. What I found was that the foundational design work was registered under your name 2 years before Kong's company filed their announcement. I sat on it for a while. Why? Because interfering in another organization's internal matters isn't something I do casually. It carries costs. He looked at her directly. What changed was the foundation accounts. When I got the documentation on the transfers, the forged authorizations, I understood that he wasn't just taking your professional work. He was dismantling your independent financial base before removing you. The word removing landed with weight. He was preparing to divorce you, Do-hyun said, after the foundation assets were transferred, after the project announcement positioned him as the sole development architect, after there was nothing left with your name on it that was also worth anything. The room was very quiet. She had suspected. The way you suspect things you can't quite let yourself know yet, the knowledge sitting in your peripheral vision while you keep your face pointed forward. Hearing it stated plainly was different from suspecting it. The dance was a signal, she said. Yes. To him. And to everyone in that room who matters. A signal that you were not alone, and that whatever he intended to do quietly was going to happen in front of people who were paying attention. She looked at him. He held her gaze with the steadiness of someone who was not afraid of being looked at carefully. What do you want from this? She said. Be direct. A partnership, formal, legitimate. Your design company and my development investment group, structured as equals for the Han River project and future projects. Your name on the work. Full ownership of your concepts. Financial backing that doesn't come with conditions on your independence. Why would you do that? Because you built something real, and it's being stolen. And because the Han River project is genuinely extraordinary, and I've read enough of your design documentation to know that it should exist exactly as you designed it. That's a business reason. Yes. Is there another reason? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She could read the difference, just honest. There might be, he said, but that's not a conversation for today. She looked at him. She thought about 8 years of being useful, without being seen. She thought about the gap between what she had survived and what she had settled for. She thought about what her grandmother's bracelet was doing on another woman's wrist at this exact moment. I'll have my lawyer review partnership terms, she said. That's all I'm asking. She stood. He stood. They were the same height, nearly. She was 5'8", and he had perhaps 2 inches on her, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she was in a room with a powerful man who had not, at any point in this conversation, moved in a way that was designed to make her feel smaller. She noticed that, filed it. The financial fraud, she said. The foundation accounts. I'm taking that to prosecutors. I know, I'd like to provide the documentation I have as supporting evidence. You'd be putting yourself in direct conflict with Black Phoenix. I'm aware. That has consequences. Ms. Brooks, something in his voice, not quite dry, not quite warm, a register she hadn't heard from him yet. I run the White Tiger organization. I'm familiar with consequences. She almost smiled. She left his office and stepped into the elevator and stood in the mirrored walls of it looking at her own reflection. A 36-year-old woman in dark slacks and flat shoes with a legal pad full of notes and an IP registration file on her laptop, and a fraud case developing and a partnership proposal on the table, and a bracelet she intended to get back. She looked like someone at the beginning of something. The elevator reached the lobby. She walked out into the Seoul morning, into the noise and the light and the ordinary machinery of a city that did not know or care what was happening to her, and she pulled out her phone and called Park Ji-soo. I need to file today, she said when he answered. The IP claim and the fraud documentation simultaneously. I don't want to give him time to move anything else. A pause on Park's end. She could hear him thinking. If we file today, he said carefully, it becomes public. The moment we file the IP claim against Black Phoenix's development project, it goes on record. The press will have it within hours. Good, Zarya said. Zarya, I spent 8 years being quiet, she said. File today. The line was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll need you in the office by noon." "I'll be there by 10." She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk in the September morning air, the river somewhere south of her, the city going about its business, and she understood with the full weight of it that she had just passed a threshold she could not walk back through. There was no quiet version of this anymore. No private settlement, no careful negotiation in a room full of people who would agree to pretend. She had handed the first document to a lawyer who would file it, and once it was filed, it would exist. And once it existed, the entire architecture of what Kang Tae-jun had built on top of her work would have to answer for itself. She thought about what he'd said in the hotel room. "Every door in this city will be closed to you." She thought, "Then I'll build new doors." Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize, but she recognized the writing immediately. The same direct, uncluttered cadence of the message the night before. Kang called an emergency meeting with his financial counsel this morning. "He knows you spoke to my office. He's moving to have your design registrations challenged on technical grounds. He'll argue that the work was created within the scope of employment for Black Phoenix's development arm and therefore belongs to the company. His legal team filed a counter motion 40 minutes ago. You have less time than you thought." She read it once. Then again. Then she was already walking, already calling Park back, already talking before he fully answered, because Tae-jun had just made his first visible move, and she had maybe 6 hours before the procedural ground shifted under her, and she had spent enough years being slow and careful and quiet. She was done being slow. The morning opened up around her like a city that was finally, for the first time, something she was moving through on her own terms. And behind her, in the architecture of everything she'd built, and everything that had been taken, the first real crack was spreading through the foundation of Kang Tae-jun's empire, the kind of crack that looks small from the surface but runs all the way down. Park Jisoo's office smelled like paper and cold coffee, and the particular anxiety of people who dealt in other people's worst days for a living. Zarya arrived at 9:47. She was 13 minutes early. Park was already at his desk with 3 associates arranged around him like a war cabinet, and the look on his face when she walked in was the look of a man who had received news he did not want to be the one to deliver. She sat down without being asked. "Tell me," she said. Park set his pen down. He was 61 years old, had been practicing intellectual property and corporate law for 35 of those years, and he had the eyes of someone who had stopped being surprised by what people did to each other for money. But something in his expression right now was not his usual professional composure. Something was sitting underneath it. "Tae-jun's team filed a motion at 7:43 this morning," he said. "Employment scope challenge. They're arguing that every design you registered under your own name, the Han River concepts, the Mapo district structures, the Green Corridor frameworks, was produced during working hours, using company resources, within the operational scope of your role as Black Phoenix Development's chief strategic architect." "I was never employed by Black Phoenix Development," Zarya said. "I had a consulting agreement, independent contractor status." "That's what your contract says." Park opened a folder. "This is what their filing says." He slid a document across the desk. She picked it up. It took her 40 seconds to understand what she was reading. Then she read it again, because the first time her brain rejected it, the way a body rejects something poisonous. The document was a revised employment agreement. Her name, her signature, dated 14 months ago. Reclassifying her status from independent consultant to full-time senior executive architect, Black Phoenix Development Division. With a clause, buried in the contract language on page 4, the kind of clause that counted on the signatory not being a lawyer, assigning all intellectual property created during the scope of employment to the company. Her signature. She looked at the signature for a long time. "That's not my signature," she said. "I know," Park said. "That is not my signature, Park. I have never signed an employment reclassification agreement. I have never agreed to—" "I know," he said again, quietly. "Zarya, I know. But they filed it with the court this morning as authenticated documentation, which means we have a forgery fight on top of the IP claim, and forgery fights take time, and while the authentication is contested, the court may issue a temporary injunction on your registrations." The room was very quiet. One of the associates, a young woman in her late 20s, was looking at her laptop with an expression that suggested the news was still coming. "What else?" Zarya said. Park glanced at the associate. The associate turned her laptop around. It was a financial filing. Black Phoenix Holdings. Corporate restructuring documents dated 11 months ago, establishing a subsidiary, BPX Architectural Solutions, with a board of directors that included a silent founding partner and equity stakeholder, Zaria M. Brooks. She had never heard of BPX Architectural Solutions. She had never agreed to be a silent partner in anything. They created a shell company, Park said, in your name, with your forged signature as founding documentation. Every design registration you filed independently. They're arguing those registrations were made by you in your capacity as a founding partner of BPX, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Black Phoenix Holdings, which means the registrations, under their argument, belong to the parent company. She set the laptop down on the desk. She set it down very carefully because her hands had started to shake, and she was not going to let her hands shake in this room. He's been building this for 14 months, she said. At least, Park said. The shell company formation is 11 months ago, but the employment reclassification is dated 14 months ago, which corresponds to the same period he started the affair, she said. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window. Park's office overlooked a side street, not the grand river view of Taijun's world, just ordinary Seoul, a dry cleaner and a pharmacy, and people walking with coffee cups. Normal life happening in full ignorance of what was being done to her in a room 40 feet above it. She had 14 months of calendar records. She had emails. She had design session logs, site visit documentation, time-stamped digital files with metadata that proved she had created every concept she registered. She had all of it, and they had a forged signature in a shell company and a 14-month head start. What does this mean for the fraud case? She said. The foundation transfers. The foundation fraud is cleaner, Park said. The forged authorizations are harder to explain. They don't have a corporate structure to hide behind on that one. They have a straight forgery problem. But Zaria... He stopped. She turned from the window. If they get the injunction on your IP registrations, he said, even a temporary one, the project goes back into contested status, which means Black Phoenix can move forward with their announcement, which means by the time we prove the forgery, they may already have government approvals, public financing commitments, construction contracts, proving ownership after all that is... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. How long until the court rules on the injunction? They filed this morning, emergency motion, Judge Kim's docket, 48 to 72 hours. 72 hours. She thought of the waterfront renderings on her office wall. 2 years. Every late night, every community consultation she'd attended in her own time, talking to residents who lived along the river and wanted to know if anyone in power actually understood what they needed. Every elderly woman who'd grabbed her arm in a community center in Yeongdeungpo and said, "Miss, will there be a place for my grandson to play?" And the way Zaria had looked at her building plans that night and added a detail she hadn't had before. She thought about Taejun standing at a press conference in 73 hours announcing that project as his. "I need everything we have on the metadata," she said. "Every time-stamped file, every email chain, every site visit log. I need a digital forensics expert to authenticate the file creation dates independent of my hard drive, server-side timestamps, cloud backup records, anything that exists outside my own hardware." "I've already called someone," Park said. "She can be here by 2. "Good." Zaria came back to the table. "And I need the forgery documentation sent to prosecutors today. Not as supporting material for the civil case. I want a criminal complaint filed. Forged signatures, fabricated corporate documentation, unauthorized use of identity to establish financial instruments. I want that on record before the injunction hearing. Filing a criminal complaint while the civil case is active complicates... I know it complicates things. File it anyway." Park looked at her for a moment. She looked back. He nodded once, the slow nod of a man who has decided to follow a client into territory he finds personally alarming. "There's one more thing," the young associate said. Her voice was careful, the kind of careful that meant she didn't want to say what she was about to say. "The press," she said. "There are 3 major outlets that have been following the gala story since last night. One of them published this morning, not the financial site, a mainstream news outlet." She turned the laptop to face Zaria again. "They have a source inside Black Phoenix who gave them a statement. Zarya read the headline. Black Phoenix responds to gala incident. Company says design dispute. Stems from disgruntled former contractor. Former contractor. She read the statement. It was 3 paragraphs of carefully assembled corporate language that managed to describe 8 years of her professional life as a work-for-hire arrangement that had ended badly, and managed to describe her, without using her name anywhere, as a woman whose bruised ego had led her to make false legal claims against the company that had generously employed her. The statement was attributed to a spokesperson, but the final paragraph was a direct quote, attributed to Kang Tae-jun himself. My company and I have always operated with full legal integrity. We look forward to presenting our documentation to any court that wishes to examine it. Zarya set the laptop down again. She was aware of being looked at. Park, the associates, all of them watching her with the particular watchfulness of people waiting to see which way a person breaks. She did not break. What happened instead was something quieter and more durable than breaking. A door closed inside her. Not the panicked slamming of something shutting out fear, a deliberate, considered close. The kind that comes after you have examined what is on the other side and decided you are not going back through. Schedule the forensics expert for 2, she said. Have the criminal complaint ready for my signature before noon. And I need Min Seo. Have her pull every community consultation record from the Han River project, every meeting note, every photo, every signed resident feedback form with dates. Community leaders, elderly residents, neighborhood association heads, people who met with me specifically, who know my face, who can testify that I was in those rooms making those decisions. She picked up her bag. I'm going to talk to some of those people myself today. Zarya, Park said, you should know. Once you start directly contacting potential witnesses while litigation is active, they're not witnesses yet. They're community members I worked with. I'm allowed to speak to people I worked with. She looked at him steadily. Park. He has a 14-month head start and forged documents and a corporate structure built to bury me. The only thing I have is the truth and the people who were actually in the room when I built this thing, so that is where I'm going. She left. The community center in Yeongdeung PO was on a side street between a laundromat and a small grocery that had been there since before the neighborhood knew what redevelopment meant. Zarya had been here 4 times during the project consultation phase. She remembered the fluorescent lights that flickered on the east side, and the table that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others, and the smell of whatever someone had always just finished cooking in the kitchen behind the meeting room. She remembered the people. Kim Bok-soon was 73 years old and had lived in Yeongdeung-po for 51 of them. She was the head of the Neighborhood Residents Association, and she had the specific authority of a woman who had attended every single community meeting about redevelopment for the past decade and had watched developers come in and talk about community benefits and leave with the money while the community got noise and dust and eventually buildings where the rent was 3 times what anyone could afford. She looked at Zarya across the wobbly table with eyes that had seen a lot of people make a lot of promises. I saw the news this morning, Kim Bok-soon said. Her Korean was deliberate, and the young woman beside her, a granddaughter, maybe 20, translated in a low murmur. They said you were just an employee, a contractor who worked for Kang's company. That's what they said, Zarya confirmed. You came to this room 4 times. You brought the drawings yourself. You sat in that chair, she pointed to the specific chair, for 3 hours on the second visit, and you drew changes right there at the table because Mrs. O wanted to know if there would be proper lighting in the plaza, and you said you would fix the lighting design that day, and you did. She folded her hands on the table. Kang Tae-jun was never in this room, not once. No, Zarya said. He wasn't. What do you need from me? Zarya looked at her, at this woman with 51 years in this neighborhood, and a table that wobbled in the specific, unimpressible gravity of someone who had been lied to by powerful men enough times to recognize the look of a woman who had not come here to lie. I need you to be willing to say that, Zarya said. Officially, to a court, if it comes to that. Kim Bok-soon was quiet for a moment. Then she said something in Korean that the granddaughter translated with a slight widening of her eyes. She says she's been waiting for someone to ask her that for about 2 years. She spent the rest of the morning moving through the neighborhood. A retired civil engineer who had reviewed her structural models and made suggestions she'd incorporated. a local business owner who had attended every consultation session and had a folder of printed materials Zarya had handed out, with her business card stapled to the cover, dated. A residents' association vice chair who had emailed Zarya directly to her personal company address, not any Black Phoenix account, 14 months ago with questions about the green corridor placement. 14 months ago. Before the forged employment agreement, before the shell company, before any of it. By 1:30, she had 7 names willing to speak. She had physical documentation in her hands, printed materials with dates and her name on them. She had emails she could subpoena from community members' personal accounts. She was getting into a cab to go back to Park's office when her phone rang. Unknown number. But she'd had 2 of those in the last 18 hours, and one of them had been right about everything, so she answered. It wasn't Do-hyun. It was a woman's voice. Low, controlled, with the particular flatness of someone speaking from a position of managed fear. Ms. Brooks, the voice said. My name is Yuna Seo. The cab moved through midday traffic. Zarya said nothing. I know you have no reason to speak to me, Yuna continued. I'm calling because I need to tell you something before this goes further, before you file everything today. There are things you don't know yet that will change what you think you're fighting. Then tell me. A pause. The sound of a door closing on Yuna. Then, not on the phone. I need to meet you, somewhere that isn't connected to Taejun's people. Every reasonable instinct Zarya had told her this was a trap. A woman who had spent 14 months sleeping with her husband and wearing her grandmother's bracelet and smiling across a ballroom while Zarya stood at a wall was not calling to help her. People who benefited from a situation did not typically call the person they'd displaced to offer useful intelligence. Why? Zarya said. Because he's going to use me as a wall between you and the real structure of what he built. If this goes to court, he'll sacrifice everything I know and everything I did to protect the parts that matter to him. I'm not going to let that happen. You're not calling me out of principle, Zarya said. You're calling because you're afraid. A beat. Yes, Yuna said. Both things are true. Zarya looked out the cab window, thought about Park's office and the criminal complaint waiting for her signature and the forensics expert arriving at 2. Thought about 14 months and forged signatures and a shell company built in her name like a coffin constructed while she was still standing. 30 minutes, she said. The cafe at the Mapo Arts Center. Corner table, public space. You come alone. I'll be there. She hung up. She told the driver to change direction. Go on. Yuna was already there when she arrived. She had not come in the pale gold gown or with the practiced elegance of the ballroom. She was wearing a dark coat and no jewelry. Zarya noticed the absence of jewelry specifically, the bare wrists. And she was holding a coffee she hadn't drunk with both hands, and she looked like a woman who had not slept. Good, Zarya thought, and was briefly ashamed of thinking it. She sat down across from her. She did not order anything. Say what you came to say, Zarya said. Yuna looked at her with the eyes of someone who has prepared a speech and is now reconsidering whether it was the right speech. Then she set the coffee down. The Shell Company, she said. BPX Architectural Solutions. I was involved in setting it up. The cafe was quiet enough that Zarya could hear the espresso machine from the bar. Go on, she said. Taejun told me it was for tax efficiency, a restructuring of how the development projects were billed. He said your name was on it because you'd agreed to it as part of a new compensation arrangement. She met Zarya's eyes. I knew that wasn't true. You knew. Not at the beginning. I found out 4 months ago. I found a document in his home office, a memorandum from his legal team outlining the full strategy. The employment reclassification, the shell company, the foundation transfers, the plan to announce the waterfront project before you could contest the registration. Yuna's jaw tightened. He was planning to file for divorce the day after the announcement. He already had the filing prepared. The day after the announcement. Strip her of the project, strip her of the professional credit, empty the foundation, divorce her when there was nothing left with her name attached to anything worth fighting for. Why didn't you come to me 4 months ago? Zarya said. Because I was afraid of him, said plainly, without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. And because I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. That you and he had a marriage I didn't understand and maybe the arrangement was what he said it was. She looked at her coffee. That was a lie, I told myself, and I knew it was a lie. What changed? The bracelet, Yuna said. The word dropped between them like a stone. He gave me that bracelet 2 months ago. He said it was a gift. I think I knew immediately, that it wasn't his to give. I wore it anyway. Her voice didn't break, but something in it narrowed. Last night, when you looked at him and said, I want it back, I couldn't. She stopped. You're telling me all of this, Zarya said slowly, and what you want in return is what, exactly? I'll testify, Yuna said. I'll give you everything I have. The memorandum, the communications between Taijun and his legal team that I have copies of, records of the Foundation transfer instructions. He gave them verbally in the apartment, but I documented them because I document everything. It's how I worked for him. I have notes. She reached into her bag and set a USB drive on the table. It's all on there, copies of everything. Zarya looked at the drive. In exchange for what? She said. Immunity recommendation from your legal team to the prosecutors. I participated in corporate document preparation. I didn't create the forgeries myself, but I was present. I assisted with filing. I need to not go to prison. The espresso machine hissed. Someone at the bar laughed at something. The ordinary afternoon moved around them. Zarya picked up the drive. She turned it over in her hand. Small thing. The weight of it was nothing. The weight of what was on it was something else entirely. I'm not a prosecutor, she said. I can't guarantee you anything. I know, but your legal team's recommendation matters. And the bracelet. Yuna reached into her bag a second time. She set it on the table between them. The diamond bracelet, Clara Brooks's bracelet, the clasp that stuck a little on the left side. Zarya looked at it. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something that has been somewhere it shouldn't have been. Then she picked it up and put it in her pocket. I'll talk to my lawyer, she said. That's what I can offer you today. Yuna nodded. She looked exhausted and resolved and not quite relieved, the face of someone who has done the right thing too late and knows it. There's something else, Yuna said. Something that isn't on the drive because I only heard it this morning. Zarya waited. He called an emergency meeting with his financial counsel at 8 a.m. I wasn't there, but his deputy, someone who's been feeding me information for weeks because he's also afraid of where this is going. He texted me 40 minutes ago. Yuna looked at her steadily. Taijun is planning to move the project announcement to tomorrow, not the original date, tomorrow. He's calling a press conference at noon. If he announces the project before the court rules on your injunction challenge, before your criminal complaint is formally processed, before any of the documentation you're filing today becomes part of the public record, he controls the narrative, Zarya said. More than that, he has a government official, Deputy Minister Choi from the Urban Development Bureau, who is prepared to stand beside him at that press conference and announce preliminary project approval. The approval was processed through channels Choi controls. Channels that were, she hesitated, channels that were lubricated over the past 6 months, significantly. Bribery, a government official, on camera, tomorrow. Zarya sat back in her chair. She thought, 72 hours for the court to rule. She had thought she had time. She did not have time. She thought about all the documents Park had waiting, all the community leaders who'd agreed to speak, all the metadata that proved every design registration was legitimate, all the evidence of fraud that was real and provable and enough. In a court, eventually, with enough time, enough process, enough of the grinding machinery of legal procedure, to win. Eventually. And tomorrow there would be Deputy Minister Choi standing at a microphone next to Kong Taijun, saying, "We approve this project, this man's project. This city will be built by Black Phoenix." And the world would take a photograph of that moment, and that photograph would be worth more than any filing she could make today. She stood up. "Don't leave Seoul," she said to Yuna. "Be reachable. My lawyer will call you before 5. She walked out of the cafe into the afternoon and called Do-hyun before she'd reached the sidewalk. He answered on the second ring. "I need to see you now," she said. "Not your office, somewhere neutral. There's a press conference tomorrow and a government official involved, and I need to know what you know about Deputy Minister Choi, and I need to know it in the next 30 minutes. A brief silence. Then, "The park at Nodal Island. 1 hour. 1 hour, she said. She was already moving. Do-hyun was standing at the river's edge when she arrived, looking at the water with his hands in his coat pockets, and he turned when he heard her footsteps on the path with the expression of a man who has already heard the news and is already thinking about the next thing. Choi Byung-won, she said, stopping beside him. Deputy Minister, Urban Development Bureau. Tell me what you know. He's been on Black Phoenix's financial ledger for 22 months, Do-hyun said. Consulting fees officially. Unofficially, it was an regulatory bypasses, zoning variances. We've known about it for 8 months. You've known about it for 8 months. Yes, and you didn't. We were building a case. He looked at her. Zarya. My organization operates in spaces where exposing a government official requires more preparation than a civil lawsuit. If I had moved too early, he would have shut down the evidence trail and we would have had nothing. How complete is your case? 70%. What does the other 30% need? A direct financial record linking the bribe payments from Black Phoenix's accounts to Choi's personal holdings. We have the consulting contracts and the circumstantial timing. We need the wire transfer documentation. She thought about the USB drive in her bag. Yuniseo met with me 20 minutes ago, she said. She has records of the foundation transfer instructions, payment records from Taejun's personal communication channels. She paused. Is it possible some of those records include payments to government accounts? Do-hyun went very still. Is that possible? She said again. Give me the drive, he said. My lawyer needs to review it first. There may not be time for— There will be time. Park Jisoo is the fastest lawyer I know, and I'm calling him right now. She pulled out her phone. If the wire transfers are on that drive, if we have the 30%, can you move on Choi before noon tomorrow? Do-hyun looked at her with the expression of a man revising his understanding of a situation in real time. If the documentation is clean, he said, if it's verifiable, yes. Then I need you to be ready, she said, because tomorrow Taejun is going to stand in front of cameras and announce my project, and I need something to happen before the last syllable leaves his mouth that makes every camera in that room turn away from him. She hit call on Park's number. The river moved south beside them, gray-green and indifferent, and above it the city arranged itself into the particular density of a place where everything was about to change and none of it yet knew. Park answered. I'm coming back to the office, she said. I have a USB drive that may contain federal bribery documentation. I need you to clear the afternoon, all of it, and I need you to call every contact you have in the prosecutor's office, because what we found is not just a civil matter anymore. It is a criminal conspiracy, and it runs all the way to the government, and we have approximately 18 hours to make that impossible to ignore. She hung up. She looked at Do-hyun. I was looking at her with something in his face that she didn't have time to examine right now. Something that was not professional, not strategic, something that belonged to a different conversation than this one. Are you all right? He said. The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected, because of how he asked it, not as a formality, as an actual question from someone who actually wanted to know the answer. She thought about it honestly. No, she said, but I will be. She turned and walked back up the path toward the road, toward a cab, toward a lawyer's office where 18 hours of the hardest work of her life were waiting, and behind her she could hear the river, and beneath that the city, and beneath that the deep structural sound of something massive beginning to give way. The sound that comes just before a foundation fails, when the cracks have reached the depth where pretending they aren't there is no longer an option for anyone in the building. Park Jisoo's conference room looked like a war room by 4 p.m. Every surface had paper on it. 3 laptops open, 2 external monitors pulled from storage, a whiteboard covered in legal notation that had been erased and rewritten twice. 4 associates working in parallel, 1 on the criminal complaint, 1 on the forensic metadata analysis, 1 cross-referencing the USB drive contents with the financial fraud documentation, 1 on the phone with the prosecutor's office in a low, continuous murmur that had been going on for 40 minutes. Zarya sat at the center of it with her jacket off and her sleeves pushed to the elbows and a pen she'd been clicking without realizing it for the last 20 minutes. The USB drive contents were on the screen in front of her. Park was beside her. The forensics expert, a compact woman named Dr. Shin, who smelled like cigarettes and spoke in the clipped cadence of someone who had testified in court enough times to have permanently abbreviated her speech, was standing at the whiteboard breaking down the file authentication timeline. The foundation transfers, Dr. Shin said, tapping a date on the board. First authorization of March 7th. Your calendar, Ms. Brooks. She turned to Zarya. Where were you March 7th? Busan, Zarya said. Site visit for the Suyongbei proposal. I have hotel records, a site visit log co-signed by the city planning liaison, and 12 hours of documented meetings. Good. Second authorization, April 19th. International Urban Development Conference, Singapore. I was on a panel. There's video of it. Dr. Shin made a mark. Third? I have them all, Zarya said. All 11. I went through every date last night. There's not one where I was in Seoul and unaccounted for. Dr. Shin looked at her with the mild appreciation of a professional encountering someone who has done their own preparation. Excellent. The metadata on the forged employment agreement is the bigger technical problem. They used a PDF authentication service that timestamps documents at the moment of processing, not the moment of creation. So the signature date looks legitimate from a surface audit. We need to get into the document's internal XML structure to show that the original file creation date is 6 days after the supposed signing date. Can you do that? Already did. I have it. She turned back to the whiteboard. The problem is not the evidence. The problem is the timeline for presenting it. Tomorrow at noon, Zarya said. Yes. The room was quiet for a moment except for the associate still on the phone. Park cleared his throat. The drive, he said. Walk us through what you found. The associate working the USB contents, a young man named Cha, who had the focused intensity of someone running on caffeine and professional alarm, turned from his laptop. The records Unicio compiled are... He stopped, visibly choosing his words. She's thorough. Years of executive assistant habits. Everything is dated, time-stamped, some of it cross-referenced. Voice memos. Transcribed meeting notes, scanned physical documents. He pulled up a file, including this. The document that appeared on the shared screen was a wire transfer record. Not a bank statement, a payment instruction memo from Taijun's personal holding company, dated 9 months prior, directing a transfer of 42 million won to an account under the name Choi Consulting Group, LLC. Then another, then another. 11 transfers over 8 months. Different amounts. Same destination account. Choi Consulting Group, Park said. Registered to a shell corporation in Busan, Cha said, with one beneficial owner. He paused. Deputy Minister Choi Byung-won. It's his account. The registration documentation is on the drive. The room went very still. Zarya looked at the screen. 42 million won, then 38 million, then 51, added up across 11 payments, across 8 months. The number that emerged was not abstract. It was a number that represented a government official selling his authority over Seoul's largest public development project. It was a number that represented a bureaucratic structure being used as a private transaction. It was a number that, presented correctly, could end careers and trigger federal investigations and make tomorrow's press conference. Not a triumphant announcement, but the last public act of a man walking into a trap he'd built himself. Send the wire transfer documentation to Do-hyun's legal team, Zarya said. Right now, tonight. They've been building a case on Choi for 8 months. They have the other 70%. This is what they needed. Are you certain about involving White Tiger in a federal bribery case? Park said carefully. Do-hyun's legal team will route it correctly. They're not going to touch it themselves. They're going to give it to the right people in the prosecutor's office. People who are already positioned. She looked at him. He told me they were 70% there. This is the 30%. Park was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, Cha, send the transfer documentation. The associate's fingers moved. Zarya's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Do-hyun. She stepped out of the conference room into the hallway. Tell me you have something on the drive, he said. 11 wire transfers. Choi Consulting Group. 8 months of payments totaling approximately 430 million won. Beneficial ownership documentation included. Silence on his end. The kind of silence that is not absence but calculation. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. Can you move before noon tomorrow? If I send this to Prosecutor Han tonight... Another pause. Han has wanted Choi for 18 months. He will not wait. He will move at dawn if he has to. What does moving look like? An arrest warrant. executed before the press conference. If Choi is in custody before noon, Tae-jun loses the government official standing beside him. He loses the preliminary approval announcement. He loses the narrative. Zarya leaned against the hallway wall. The building hummed around her. She was exhausted in the specific way of a person who has been operating on adrenaline and precision for 16 hours and can feel the edges of both starting to thin. "Do it," she said. "It's done." Then quieter. "Go home tonight. Sleep a few hours if you can." "I'll sleep when it's over." "Zarya." She stopped. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "you built something real. They can forge documents and file motions and move press conferences. They cannot change what is true." She pressed the back of her head against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 4 seconds. "Send the files," she said, and went back into the conference room. Up. She did not sleep. She went to her office at midnight and sat at her desk and looked at the waterfront renderings on the wall and drank bad coffee and read through every document in the criminal complaint one more time, looking for gaps, looking for anything that could be used to slow them down, redirect, delay. Finding nothing she hadn't already found and addressed and reinforced. At 2 a.m., her phone showed a message from Do Hyun's assistant. "Files received. Transferred to Prosecutor Han's office at 11:47 p.m. Confirmation of receipt acknowledged." At 4 a.m., Min Seo appeared at the office door with a takeout bag and the expression of a 26-year-old who had been awake as long as her employer and was refusing to acknowledge that this was unusual. "You didn't have to come in," Zarya said. "I know." Min Seo set the bag on the desk. The community center in Yeongdeungpo called. "Mrs. Kim Bok-soon wants to know if she should be at the courthouse or somewhere else tomorrow. She says she has her meeting notes in a folder she's kept since the first consultation. She says she's been keeping them specifically because she never trusted how these things end." Zarya looked at the takeout bag. Rice and soup, the kind of food that meant someone was taking care of you. "Tell her the courthouse," Zarya said. "Tell her to bring the folder." She ate. She went back to the documents. The morning arrived gray and cool, September in Seoul pulling toward autumn, the sky the color of something that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do. Zarya arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 in the same dark slacks and flat shoes she'd been moving through the world in for 2 days. She'd gone home at 6, showered, changed, and come back looking like a person who had slept even though she hadn't, which was a skill she'd developed years ago when Tae-jun's schedule made sleep a negotiating position rather than a given. Park met her on the steps. He had the look of a man who'd had 4 hours of sleep and a strong opinion about the morning. "The injunction hearing is at 10, he said. "Judge Kim's courtroom. Tae-jun's team has filed a supplemental brief overnight. They added affidavits from 2 former Black Phoenix Development employees who claim they supervised your work within the company structure." "Who?" He named them. She knew them both, had worked alongside them for years, had helped one of them navigate a zoning dispute that saved his department's project budget. The other she had once spent 3 hours with on a phone call during a contractor crisis, solving a problem that was not technically in her scope to solve. "They signed affidavits," she said, "last night, under pressure, likely, possibly under promise of continued employment in whatever structure emerges from this." Park paused. "It doesn't necessarily sink us. Their testimony about supervision can be challenged with the metadata and the independent witnesses, but it adds complication and the judge may weigh it." "How is Prosecutor Han moving?" Park checked his phone. As of 40 minutes ago, an arrest warrant for Deputy Minister Choi was issued. Execution, meaning the actual arrest, is being coordinated with the Anti-Corruption Investigation Unit. Timeline uncertain. Could be this morning, could be later. "It needs to be before noon. I know that." She looked at the courthouse steps. People moving in and out, the regular machinery of legal process, disputes about property and contracts, and the infinite human capacity to harm each other through paperwork. "Where's Tae-jun?" she said. "His team is already inside. He's here for the hearing." She nodded. She walked up the steps. Courtroom 4B was a mid-sized room with the impersonal gravity of a space designed to make everyone in it feel small by default. Pale wood paneling, a seal on the wall, fluorescent lighting that flattened everything into the same severity. The gallery had a handful of observers, a couple of journalists she recognized, 2 people she didn't, who had the watching carefully posture of people connected to one side or the other. Tae-jun was at the respondents' table with his legal team. 3 lawyers, all expensive, all arranged with the visible competence of people who had prepared thoroughly and believed their preparation was sufficient. He was wearing a charcoal suit, different from the gala suit, but the same category of garment, the same statement of control. He looked at her when she walked in. She looked back. His expression did not change. Neither did hers. They were 2 people who had shared a bed and a life and 8 years of constructed proximity and now occupied opposite sides of a legal proceeding, and the distance between them was not emotional. Emotions had already been spent, but architectural. The structure of what they'd built together had collapsed, and they were standing in the rubble on different sides of the fault line. She sat down beside Park. She folded her hands on the table. Judge Kim entered at 10:02. The room stood and sat in the practiced rhythm of legal procedure. The hearing opened. Tae-jun's lead attorney, a man named Baek, who had the self-assurance of someone accustomed to winning on procedural grounds, presented the employment reclassification argument with the smooth confidence of a man who believed he had already won and was engaged in the formality of explaining why. The forged employment agreement, the BPX subsidiary structure, the affidavits from the 2 former employees. He built it carefully, each piece placed like a brick, the structure rising into something that looked, from one angle, exactly like what he said it was. Zarya watched the judge's face. Kim was in her mid-50s with the careful expressionlessness of a judge who had learned that her face was the most important piece of theater in the room and controlled it accordingly. She took notes. She asked 2 clarifying questions. Her face gave nothing. Park presented the counter-argument. The timestamp metadata on the forged employment agreement, Dr. Shin's technical analysis, entered into evidence. The original IP registrations, 2 years prior, predating any claimed employment reclassification. The independent community witnesses, affidavits from Kim Bok-soon and 4 others, testifying to direct professional engagement with Zarya in her capacity as the originating architect at dates that preceded the forged documentation. The verified alibis for 11 of the fraudulent authorization dates on the foundation transfers. Beck objected to 3 pieces of evidence on technical grounds. The judge overruled 2 and reserved judgment on the 3rd. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. At 11:41, Judge Kim announced she was taking a brief recess to review supplemental materials before issuing a ruling. The room stood. The judge left. Zarya released a breath she had been holding for some portion of the last 90 minutes and felt it leave her body in a long, controlled exhale that she managed to make look like nothing. Park leaned close. She overruled both of Beck's major objections. That's a signal. Or she's covering procedural ground before she rules against us. Possibly. He paused. The metadata evidence is clean. Dr. Shin's documentation is airtight. If the judge reads it the way any competent jurist would. Zarya's phone vibrated in her pocket. She looked at it under the table. Do Hyun, Choi arrested, 17 minutes ago. Anti-corruption investigation unit. He's in custody. The press conference is officially without its government endorsement. She typed back. Confirmed? Confirmed. His office has been notified. The Urban Development Bureau has issued a statement saying all project approvals under his authority are under immediate administrative review. Administrative review. Every approval Choi had signed for Black Phoenix's waterfront project in the last 8 months was now suspended pending investigation, including the preliminary approval he'd been prepared to announce at noon. She put the phone back in her pocket. She looked across the room at Tae-jun. He was on his phone. His expression had shifted. The controlled surface had developed a fracture, something behind his eyes moving fast, recalculating. One of his lawyers leaned over and said something in a low voice, and Tae-jun's jaw tightened in the way she had seen it tighten hundreds of times, the tightening that meant the ground had shifted under him and he was deciding whether to adapt or fight the shift. He looked up and found her watching him. She did not look away. His phone buzzed. He read the screen. And she watched. In real time, across 12 feet of pale wood courtroom, the specific moment when Kang Tae-jun understood that the press conference at noon was no longer a weapon in his hand. The judge returned at 12:03. Everyone stood. Judge Kim settled at the bench and arranged her papers with the particular deliberateness of a person who has made a decision and is giving the room a moment to prepare for it. Having reviewed the submitted evidence, including the technical forensic analysis of the documentary timeline and the independent witness attestations, she said. This court finds insufficient grounds to impose a temporary injunction on the intellectual property registrations filed by Miss Zaria Brooks. The motion is denied. The motion is denied. Park exhaled. Zaria sat very still. Furthermore, Judge Kim continued, the court notes with concern the questions raised by the forensic analysis regarding the authenticity of certain documents submitted by the respondent. This court is referring those materials to the appropriate investigative authority for review. She set down her papers. This hearing is adjourned. She stood. The room stood. Taejun's lead attorney was already moving toward him, talking in a rapid undertone. Taejun stood very still, which was worse than movement, worse than reaction. The stillness of a man who had just watched a structure he built over 14 months begin to come apart and was deciding how much of it he could still hold. Zaria picked up her bag. She did not look at him again. She walked out of the courtroom into the hallway and kept walking until she found a window at the end of the corridor that overlooked a small courtyard below. And she stood in front of it and pressed both palms flat against the glass and let herself, just for 30 seconds, feel the full weight of the last 18 hours come through her hands and into the glass and pass on through. 30 seconds. Then she pulled her hands back and stood up straight. Park appeared beside her. He looked slightly stunned, which for Park meant he felt something close to amazed. The referral to investigative authority, he said. That is not a routine procedural note. That is a judge signaling that she believes criminal conduct occurred in the preparation of those documents. I know, Zaria said. Combined with the Choi arrest, Park. She turned to face him. What time is the press conference? He checked his phone. Was scheduled for noon. It's 11:58. Is it still happening? He looked at his screen, at something arriving in real time. Black Phoenix's communications office just sent a postponement notice, citing, he read, unforeseen administrative developments requiring clarification before proceeding. Unforeseen. She almost laughed. She would have laughed if she wasn't so tired. Where is Taejun? She said. Still inside, I'd assume. His team will be regrouping. I need to make a statement, she said, to whoever is out there. The journalists who came for the press conference that isn't happening. They're going to be looking for a story, and I have one. She straightened her collar. Can you call Min Seo and have her bring the architectural documentation? The renderings? The community consultation records? The registered design portfolio? I want to stand in front of those cameras with actual evidence of what I built. Park was already on his phone. There were 9 journalists outside the Han River Grand Hotel at 12:15, milling around a media setup that had been configured for a press conference that had just been canceled without explanation. Some of them had already heard about Choi's arrest. News moved fast when it involved a government official and a corruption charge. Some of them were still piecing together the connection between the gala 2 nights ago and the IP hearing that morning and the deputy minister being walked out of his office by anti-corruption investigators. Zaria arrived with Min Seo carrying a portfolio case and Park Jisoo standing slightly behind and to the left, in the particular position of a lawyer who is present but letting his client speak for herself. She did not have a podium. She did not have a prepared statement. She stood on the hotel steps in the same dark slacks she'd been wearing for 2 days, and she looked at the cameras, and she started talking. She talked for 11 minutes. She explained the waterfront project, what it was designed to do, what the community consultations had revealed about what the people of Yeongdeungpo and Mapo and Dongjak actually needed from the development of that riverfront. She talked about affordable housing and green corridors and what happens when city development is designed by someone who has actually sat in the room with the people who live there. She talked about the IP registrations, time-stamped 2 years ago, predating any claim from Black Phoenix. She mentioned the forensic analysis, the community witnesses, the judge's ruling 20 minutes prior. She did not mention Taejun's name. Not once. She held up the architectural renderings, her handwriting in the margins, the design evolution visible across successive versions, the kind of authentic document trail that cannot be forged because its messiness is its authenticity. When she finished, one of the journalists, a woman from a financial news outlet, asked, "Are you saying Kang Taejun stole your work?" Zaria looked at her. "I'm saying the court record will establish what happened," she said. "I'm saying those are my designs, my registrations, my community consultations, my 2 years of work. I'm saying the people who live along that river met with me. I'm saying I intend to build what I promised them. She paused. You can draw your own conclusions about what that means. Another journalist. What's your response to Black Phoenix's statement calling you a disgruntled former contractor? I have a company, Zarya said. I have 14 employees. I have clients. I have an IP registration portfolio that predates their documentation by 24 months. I have a court ruling from this morning. She looked at the camera directly. Former contractor is one way to describe someone. Another way is the person who built the thing. She left the cameras and walked back to the street, and her phone was already ringing. 3 calls? 4. The specific volume of a story catching fire in real time. She let them ring. She got into the car Minseo had waiting, and she sat in the back seat and she let herself close her eyes for the length of 1 city block. Then she opened them. Boss. Tajan found her at 4 p.m. She was in her office, at her actual desk, not a conference room, not a lawyer's table, going through the partnership terms Do Hyun's legal team had sent over, reading each clause with the attention of a person who intended to know exactly what she was agreeing to before she agreed to anything. He came in through the office front door, which meant he'd walked past the reception desk and Minseo, which meant Minseo had let him through, which meant Minseo had calculated that Zarya would want to have this conversation on her own ground, and made a judgment call that turned out to be correct. He closed the door behind him. He looked, and she noticed this with the detached clarity of exhaustion. He looked like she felt, which was to say, like someone who had been awake too long and had spent that wakefulness watching something come apart that they could not put back together. He sat down across from her without being invited. She set the partnership terms face down on her desk. Choi, he said. Yes. You moved on him last night. The documentation moved to the right people. Yes. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. The press conference. There was no press conference. You killed it. The arrest of the government official whose signature was supposed to legitimize it killed it, she said. I just provided the evidence. He was quiet. She had not, in 9 years, often seen Taijun quiet in the way he was quiet right now. Not the controlled silence of a man choosing his words, but the heavier stillness of someone who has run out of the particular kind of energy it takes to perform certainty. The foundation, he said. I filed a criminal complaint, forged authorizations, fraudulent transfer of charitable assets. Zarya. The bracelet is in my bag, she said. I have it. I'm not discussing the bracelet. Something moved across his face. The closest thing to pain she had seen from him in years, which was either genuine or a performance sufficiently sophisticated that the distinction didn't matter. I didn't plan to hurt you, he said. She looked at him. I know that's not... He stopped. I know that's not sufficient. I know what it looks like, what it was. But I want you to know I didn't... You forged my signature on documents designed to strip me of my life's work, she said. You used my name to establish a shell company that was going to absorb my IP. You drained a scholarship fund I built in my grandmother's name. And you planned to file for divorce the day after you stood in front of cameras and claimed credit for 2 years of my labor. She said it evenly. Not shouting, not cold, just the plain recitation of a series of facts. Tell me what part of that wasn't planned. He said nothing. I'm going to finish building the waterfront project, she said. Under my name, with legitimate financing, and it's going to look exactly like what I designed because I designed it for the people who actually live there, not for a press photograph. She picked up the partnership terms. You should talk to your lawyers about the criminal exposure you're looking at. I'd suggest doing it before the end of the day. He stood. He stood slowly, like someone whose body was heavier than it was supposed to be. He moved to the door. He put his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, he said, without turning around. It's not, she said. He left. Minseo appeared in the doorway 6 seconds later. She looked at the closed door and then at Zarya with the particular expression of a 26-year-old who has witnessed something large and is processing whether to say anything about it. Hold all calls for 20 minutes, Zarya said. Minseo nodded and disappeared. Zarya sat alone in her office with the partnership terms in her hands and her grandmother's bracelet in her bag, and 2 years of waterfront renderings on the wall, and the city going about its business outside the window, completely indifferent to the private wreckage of the last 48 hours. She thought about Kim Bok-soon and her folder of meeting notes. She thought about the young woman in Singapore she'd awarded the last scholarship before the foundation account was emptied. A 22-year-old architecture student from Atlanta, first in her family to study abroad, who had emailed Zaria a photograph of herself standing outside her design school on the first day of class. She thought, I have to refund that account. She thought, I have to build this project. She thought, I am so tired. She sat still for the 20 minutes she'd given herself. Then she turned back to the partnership terms and kept reading, because the thing about not being done is that you are simply not done, and the work is the work, and the only direction that exists is forward into it. At 6:17 p.m., Do-hyun's lawyer called with a revised partnership clause and a question about equity structure that took 40 minutes to resolve and required Park to conference in on a three-way call that lasted until well past 7. At 8 p.m., Min Seo brought more food and more bad coffee. At 9 p.m., the financial news outlet published a 1,200-word piece on the Han River waterfront project dispute, with photographs of Zaria's original design renderings and a timeline of the IP registrations, and a quote from Kim Bok-soon that read, "She sat in this room with us. She drew the changes right here at the table. I kept every piece of paper she ever handed me because I knew someone would need to know the truth someday." Zaria read it at her desk. She did not cry. She had told herself she would not cry until this was actually over, and it was not actually over yet. There was a divorce proceeding, and criminal charges developing, and a partnership to finalize, and a project to actually build, which was a year of work at minimum. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at her renderings. The plaza detail in the third rendering, the one she'd added the night Mrs. O asked about lighting, the green corridor through the residential section, the community market space in the ground floor of the third residential tower, the one that was specifically sized for small local vendors rather than chain retail, because she had asked the right people what they actually wanted, and they had told her and she had listened. She looked at all of it. Then she picked up her pen and made a small notation on the equity structure worksheet that Park had faxed her, a handwritten note about a specific financial guarantee she wanted included in the partnership agreement before she signed anything. And the pen moved across the paper with the practiced certainty of a woman who knows exactly what she is building and why, which is the only kind of certainty that has ever been worth anything. Outside the window, Seoul moved through its night, the lights of the Han River bridges strung south of her, the city density in every direction, millions of people in buildings designed by someone, built by someone, lived in by someone who needed the space to be more than just architecture, needed it to mean something about what was possible when you built for people instead of for the photograph of the ribbon-cutting ceremony. She was still at her desk at 11 p.m. when her phone showed a message from an unknown number. The same cadence, the same direct compression, the text of someone who did not waste words. Black Phoenix's financial council met tonight. Emergency session. They've suspended Taejun's operational authority pending investigation. The council is cooperating with prosecutors. He has no organization to go back to. She read it. Then she set the phone face down on the desk and pressed both hands flat against the cool surface of it, and she held that pressure for a long moment, feeling the solid fact of the desk beneath her palms, the solid fact of the building around her, the solid fact of 2 years of design work registered in her name in a courthouse file that a judge had refused to override. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, for the first time in 48 hours, Zaria Brooks sat in her own office in the city she had helped build and let herself believe that the worst of it was behind her, and that what was ahead was not easy, but was hers, and that there was a significant difference between those two things that she intended to spend a long time understanding. The city lights moved on the window glass like something alive. She kept working. The criminal trial of Kang Taejun began on a Tuesday in late November, 11 weeks after the gala. Seoul had turned cold by then, the specific, clean cold of a city that knows how to do winter, the Han River going gray and serious under skies that meant business. Zaria wore a charcoal wool coat she'd owned for 6 years, the one with the slight pull at the left cuff she'd never bothered to repair, and she walked up the courthouse steps the same way she'd walked up every set of steps for the past 11 weeks, like a woman who had somewhere to be and intended to get there. The trial had been consolidated: financial fraud, money laundering, forgery of legal instruments, conspiracy to defraud, and bribery of a public official, 5 charges. Not all of them would stick in their original form. Park had told her this early, told her to expect reduction in negotiation and the grinding attrition of a process that was not designed for clean outcomes. She had listened and nodded and gone back to work. Deputy Minister Choi had already entered a plea agreement 6 weeks prior. His cooperation with prosecutors had dismantled the bribery structure with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the only way to reduce a sentence was to be more useful to the government than the person you were helping to prosecute. He had named dates, amounts, account numbers, the specific conversations in which Tae-jun had made clear what he expected in exchange for the consulting fees. He had handed over his own records with the hollow efficiency of a man who has decided that self-preservation is the only principle worth maintaining when everything else has already been surrendered. The preliminary approval for the Black Phoenix waterfront project had been formally rescinded. Every zoning variance, every regulatory bypass signed by Choi's office in the past 8 months was under administrative review. Some would be invalidated. Some would hold because the projects themselves were legitimate and the corruption was procedural rather than substantive. But the Han River waterfront project, Zarya's project, the one Tae-jun had tried to stand in front of like a man claiming a building he hadn't built, was clean. It had always been clean. Its registrations predated Choi's involvement by nearly 2 years. It needed no variance and no bypass because it had been designed by someone who understood the actual requirements and had met them from the beginning. Zarya took her seat in the gallery. She was not a party to the criminal trial. She was a witness, scheduled to testify on the 3rd day. Today was opening statements. Park sat beside her. He'd trimmed his hair since the last time she'd seen him in a setting that wasn't a conference room or a courthouse corridor, and he looked slightly more human for it. "Yuna testifies first," he said quietly. "Prosecution's lead witness." "I know. How are you feeling about that?" She thought about the question with more honesty than it perhaps deserved. "I'm feeling like I want it to go well," she said. "For practical reasons. Just practical. Mostly practical." He nodded, which was his version of accepting an incomplete answer without pressing it. Yuna Seo entered from the witness preparation room at 9:04. She was dressed plainly, dark navy, no jewelry, hair pulled back, with the deliberate understatement of someone who had been coached to present a particular image and also happened to believe that image was appropriate. She looked straight ahead as she moved to the stand. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Tae-jun. Tae-jun was at the defendant's table in a suit that was expensive but less expensive than his usual, which was either a genuine reflection of diminished resources or a costume choice advised by his legal team. He was sitting very straight. His face had the quality of a surface that had been smoothed over something rough. Not quite controlled, not quite broken, the expression of a man maintaining form in a room that was about to take it apart. The prosecutor, a woman named Lim Ji-young, who had the compact, forward-leaning posture of someone who ran and meant it, walked Yuna through the testimony with methodical patience. The foundation transfers. The dates. The verbal instructions she had documented in her personal notes. The memorandum she had found in Tae-jun's home office outlining the full strategy: reclassification, shell company, asset drainage, divorce filing. Yuna spoke clearly. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when the shaking has already happened privately, and what remains is just the fact of what needs to be said. When Prosecutor Lim asked her to describe the instructions she had received regarding the foundation transfers, Yuna said, "He told me the funds needed to be moved to the holding company structure before the end of the fiscal quarter. He said Zarya would be signing off on it. I asked him if I should confirm that with her directly. He said that wouldn't be necessary." "And did you understand at that point that Ms. Brooks had not in fact signed off on these transfers?" A pause. Short. The length of a decision. "Yes," Yuna said. "I understood." "Why did you proceed?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Because I had made a series of choices by that point that made stopping feel like it required more courage than I had," she said. "I'm not offering that as an excuse. I'm offering it as what was true." The room was very quiet. Tae-jun's defense attorney, Baek, the same man from the injunction hearing, looking somewhat less self-assured than he had been 3 months ago, cross-examined with the focused aggression of someone trying to establish that Yuna's testimony was the manipulation of a woman with personal motivation to destroy her former partner. He pressed on the relationship. He pressed on the timeline of when she began documenting things and what her incentive was for retaining records. Yuna answered each question with the flatness of someone who has thought carefully about the difference between things that are true and things that can be made to seem true, and has decided to only say things that are both. You kept records of private communications, Beck said. Verbal instructions, meeting notes from conversations inside a private residence. Why? Because I worked for Taejun for 6 years, Yuna said. I documented everything he told me because he required thorough documentation and because I understood, from early in our professional relationship, that he did not always take responsibility for what he'd directed people to do when outcomes were negative. She looked at the attorney with steady eyes. I kept records because that's what you do when you work for someone who rewrites history when it's convenient. A short silence. Beck moved on. Zarya testified on the third day. She had expected to be more nervous than she was. She had been nervous during the preparation sessions with Park, when she'd practiced responding to anticipated cross-examination and found that the anticipation of questions was worse than the questions themselves, which was almost always true about terrible things. On the stand, she felt instead something she hadn't expected, a clarifying calm. Not the performed stillness she'd been doing for years. Something else. The stillness of a person who has nothing to manage. No image to protect, no performance to maintain, no version of herself she's been asked to present that differs from the actual version. She answered the prosecution's questions about the design process, the registrations, the dates. She described, with the technical precision of a professional who had spent 2 years deeply inside this work, exactly how the waterfront project had been conceived, developed, and documented. She talked about the community consultations. She named Mrs. Kim Bok-soon and described the session at the community center in Yeongdeung-po, where she had drawn modifications at the table because an elderly woman had asked about the lighting in the plaza. Was Kang Tae-jun present at any of these community consultations? Prosecutor Lim asked. No, Zarya said. Did he contribute to the design concepts registered under your name? No. Did he provide direction or guidance that materially shaped the project as you designed it? She thought about this with actual care. The honesty of it mattered to her more than the legal strategy. He provided the initial investment capital that allowed the project to begin, she said. He provided operational context, the political landscape of who needed to approve what, the financial structures that would make the development viable. That was real. That was not nothing. She paused. He did not design anything. He did not conceive of anything. The project as it exists, as it will be built, is not his work. Beck's cross-examination was thorough and unpleasant in the way that effective cross-examination is designed to be. He pressed her on the nature of her working relationship with Tae-jun, trying to establish that the boundary between professional and personal was blurred enough to make her claims of independent authorship ambiguous. He suggested that designs developed in shared spaces, during shared time, using resources provided by Tae-jun's business structure, existed in a gray area that the court should view with caution. She answered each question precisely. She did not become defensive. She did not become cold. She was simply a woman on a stand telling the truth about her own work. And the truth about one's own work has a particular texture that is difficult to undermine because it is full of specific, unimportant details that a person who did not do the work would not know to invent. She described the corner of her office where she did preliminary sketching because the light was better. She described the particular software version she had been using when she created the first structural framework of the Riverside residential towers, and the bug in that version that had required her to reconstruct a portion of the foundation calculations manually. She described the specific conversation she'd had with a civil engineer named Mr. Bay, who had subsequently submitted an affidavit, in which she'd asked about load-bearing specifications for buildings on riverbank soil composition, and what he'd told her, and how she'd incorporated it. She was on the stand for 4 hours. When she stepped down, Park was waiting at the gallery entrance with the expression of a man trying not to show how relieved he was. Good, he said, which from Park was the equivalent of an ovation. The verdict came on a Thursday, 6 weeks after testimony concluded. Zarya was in her office when Park called. She was on the phone with a construction contractor about Phase 1 material sourcing and she put that call on hold and listened to Park read the verdict summary in the measured cadence of someone who has delivered many verdicts over a long career and understands that the person on the other end needs the information clearly more than they need it quickly. Kang Tae-jun, guilty on 3 of 5 counts. Financial fraud, guilty. Conspiracy to defraud, guilty. Bribery of a public official, guilty. The forgery charges had been partially reduced in scope. The money laundering charge had been argued down to a related but lesser offense through a late-stage negotiation his attorneys had managed. The sentence, 7 years, with possibility of parole after 4.5, contingent on conduct and cooperation with ongoing asset recovery proceedings. 7 years. She sat down in her desk chair. She thought she would feel more. She had expected the verdict to land with the weight of finality. Some conclusion of a thing that had been unfinished for so long that its finishing would be enormous. Instead, what she felt was something much smaller and much more human, a tiredness that was not bad. The tiredness of a long walk completed. The asset recovery, she said. The foundation funds. The court has ordered recovery proceedings on the full $480,000, Park said. It'll take time. The funds were routed through several layers, but the criminal conviction makes the recovery order enforceable. We'll see most of it back within 18 months, possibly all of it. The scholarship, she said. I want the scholarship accounts refunded before anything else. Before any legal fees, before anything. The foundation accounts first. A brief pause. That's your call to make, Park said. Then that's what I'm making. She hung up and called Min Seo, who already knew. It was in the news alerts that had started hitting phones 14 minutes after the verdict was read. The way things always hit phones now, immediate and simultaneous, and without the interval that used to exist between a thing happening and a person knowing it had happened. Do you want me to cancel the afternoon? Min Seo asked. No, Zarya said. I have a meeting with the Phase 1 contractor at 3. Keep it. A short pause. Then, quietly, Are you okay? She thought about the question. Min Seo was 26 years old and had worked beside her through 11 weeks of the most difficult professional and personal period of her life, had brought food at midnight and changed meeting schedules without complaint, and made judgment calls like letting Tae-jun into the office that day, the right judgment calls, and asked nothing about any of it except this. Are you okay? Yeah, Zarya said. I think I actually am. Uniseo accepted a plea agreement that included cooperation credit and 18 months of supervised release in lieu of incarceration. She left Seoul 3 weeks after sentencing. Zarya did not know where she went and did not pursue the information. The bracelet was in the drawer of her bedside table. She had not worn it yet. She was not ready to wear it yet, and she was at peace with not being ready. The Black Phoenix Syndicate's dismantling was not clean or fast. Criminal organizations of that scale and that age do not collapse. They fracture and redistribute, the financial structures folding into legitimate businesses or other organizations, the people finding new configurations of allegiance and authority. Do-hyun had explained this to her early on with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had spent his adult life in proximity to these structures and understood their actual mechanics. The criminal empire doesn't disappear, he'd told her. The name does. The specific configuration does. The people find somewhere else to go. Does that bother you? She had asked. What bothers me, he'd said carefully, is when harm continues. The specific organizational structure isn't the thing I'm focused on. He had looked at her with that steady assessment that she had learned was not performed. Are you asking because it bothers you? I'm asking because I wanted to know what you actually think. Then that's what I actually think. It was one of the earliest conversations she'd had with him that was not about strategy or evidence or legal procedure, and she had filed it. The same way she filed things, in the space behind her sternum where she kept the assessments that mattered. The groundbreaking for Phase 1 of the Han River Waterfront Revitalization Project happened in March, on a cold, clear day with a sky the particular washed blue of Seoul in early spring. Zarya stood at the site in a hard hat and her work coat and her flat shoes, which were not appropriate for a muddy construction site, and which she wore anyway because she was not the type of person who owned appropriate for muddy construction site shoes and wasn't going to start being that type of person at this stage of her life. Kim Bok-soon was there. She had insisted on being there, had told Minseo when the invitation was extended that she would need transportation arranged because her knees were not what they used to be, but she was not missing this. She stood at the edge of the site area with her granddaughter beside her and her folder of meeting notes under her arm. Still carrying it, still keeping it, the meticulous archive of a woman who had understood from the beginning that someone would eventually need to know what was true. Zarya walked over to her before the ceremony started. "You brought the folder," she said. "Of course I brought it," Mrs. Kim said. "I'm going to keep it until the building is finished. Then I'm going to put it somewhere safe." She looked at the muddy ground, the staked-out perimeter, the beginning of something. "You said there would be a place for my grandson to play." "There will be," Zarya said. "Third residential tower, ground level, community plaza, northwest corner. I'll show you the final rendering when you have time." Mrs. Kim looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had attended enough city development promises to know the difference between the kind that were made to be forgotten and the kind that were made to be kept. "Good," she said. The ceremony was simple. Zarya had kept it simple deliberately. No large stage, no elaborate audio system, no politician standing at a microphone in front of cameras looking like someone who had done something. Just the site and the people who were going to build it, and some of the people from the community who were going to live in it or use it or walk along the riverbank it was going to open up. She spoke for 8 minutes. She talked about what the project was trying to do and what it would take to do it well, and what she needed from the people who would be building it, which was attention and craft, and the willingness to tell her when something wasn't right rather than proceeding with something wrong because it was easier. She did not talk about the legal proceedings. She did not talk about what the project had almost become. She did not make a speech about survival or reclamation or any of the larger narrative that the press had been building around the project since the gala and the trial and the verdict. She talked about architecture, about what buildings were for, about the difference between designing a space that looks impressive in a photograph and designing a space that a person wants to actually be in, wants to return to, feels comfortable in on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when nothing significant is happening. "The best compliment I ever received," she said, "was from a community member in this neighborhood who told me the plaza design looked like someone had thought about what it would feel like to be old, sitting on a bench there in the afternoon." She paused. "That's what I'm trying to build. Something that thinks about the person who will actually use it." She stepped back. Construction crew leads in hard hats stood in a line. Shovels went into ground. Cameras clicked. Do-hyun was at the back of the gathered group, standing slightly apart in the way he had of occupying the edge of a room rather than its center when the center belonged to someone else. He was not in a suit. Dark coat, hands in pockets, watching. When she caught his eye across the site, he gave her the small, real smile of someone who had put his own resources behind a vision he believed in and was standing at the moment when the belief became concrete. She smiled back. It was not a complicated smile. It was just a smile. The partnership between Brooks Design Consulting and White Tiger Holdings had been finalized 4 months earlier, after 6 weeks of clause-by-clause negotiation that Park had called the most meticulously structured partnership agreement he had drafted in 30 years. The equity structure was equal. The IP ownership was unambiguous. Every design concept originating from Zarya's practice remained her intellectual property, with the partnership holding a limited licensing right for the duration of jointly funded projects only. The governance structure gave neither party override authority on the other's decisions without a formal dispute process. Do-hyun had not argued a single point on the IP clauses. "You didn't push back on any of the ownership terms," she had said to him, early on, when this still surprised her. "Why would I?" he'd said. "Most investors push back on IP clauses." "Most investors are investing in the IP," he said. "I'm investing in the person who creates it. That's a different calculation." She had looked at him for a moment. "That could be a very clever way of framing a control structure." "It could be," he said. "Is that what it feels like?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "That's what makes me cautious about it." He had nodded at that, the slow nod of someone receiving information they respect. "I think caution is appropriate," he said. "I think you should be slow about trusting anything right now. I'm not in a hurry." She had filed that conversation the same way she filed the earlier ones. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in February, between a site visit in the morning and a contractor call in the afternoon. Park sent her the confirmation document. She signed the acknowledgement form, sent it back, and went to the contractor call. There was no ceremony to it. There did not need to be. The marriage had ended long before the legal document said it had, and the legal document was a formality applied to a structure that had already collapsed. She had no grief left for it that she hadn't already spent in the months prior. What she had, instead, was the specific quiet clarity of a person who has completed a hard thing and is standing on the other side of it with full knowledge of what it cost and what it was worth. It cost her 8 years of invisible labor and the near loss of her professional identity and $480,000 of scholarship money and her grandmother's bracelet spending several months on the wrong wrist. What it was worth was harder to quantify in the clean way that costs can be quantified. But she thought it was worth the understanding that she was not the woman she'd been before, not in the way that meant she'd been made better by suffering, which was a story she'd always found slightly insulting, as though pain were a necessary ingredient in worthwhile people. She was different. She knew more about herself than she had. She knew the difference between stillness chosen and stillness imposed, between quiet as strength and quiet as surrender. She knew what she would not do again, not because someone had told her not to, but because she had done it and understood the cost in the specific personal way that only experience teaches. She wore her grandmother's bracelet for the first time on the day the divorce was finalized. She put it on in the morning before the site visit, standing in her bathroom in her work clothes, the clasp sticking a little on the left side the way it always had. She fastened it with both hands and looked at it in the mirror for a moment. Clara Brooks's bracelet. 30 years of church mornings and a seamstress's careful savings and a hospital room handoff and the words, "This is evidence that women in this family survive things." She wore it to the site visit. She wore it to the contractor call. She wore it to the dinner that evening where she met with 3 of her junior architects to review the Phase 1 structural drawings and talk through the construction sequencing. She wore it like what it was, not a wound, not a reclamation, just an inheritance, something that had always been hers, worn by a woman who was still becoming whoever she was going to be next. The dinner with Do Hyun happened in April, 4 months after the groundbreaking, on a Friday evening when the city had finally turned warm again, and Seoul was doing what Seoul does in spring, not blooming prettily, but insisting on itself with the specific aggressive vitality of a city that doesn't know how to be subtle about anything. It was not a business dinner, they had established this clearly, which meant they had both acknowledged that the line between what had been business and what was becoming something else was no longer a line they were pretending didn't exist. He had chosen a small restaurant in Mapo, the kind of place with 8 tables and a menu that didn't have prices because the price was the food and the food was the point. She arrived on time. He was already there, which she had come to understand was his preference. He liked to be in a room before the person he was meeting arrived, liked to have the lay of the space, which was partly professional habit, and partly, she suspected, a form of attentiveness, wanting to see someone arrive rather than having someone watch you arrive. She sat down across from him. "You look tired," he said. "I've been on a construction site for 4 days straight. How is it going?" The Northwest Foundation drainage is more complicated than the original soil survey indicated. We're going to need an additional engineering consult and 3 extra weeks on that corner of the site. She looked at him. "It's fine. It's how building goes." He ordered wine. She let him order wine and then told him what she would and wouldn't drink, which he noted and the server noted and adjusted accordingly, without any of the performance of consideration that would have made the adjustment feel like a concession. It just happened. She was mildly aware of noticing that it just happened. They talked about the project for a while because the project was real and ongoing and important to them both, and there was no reason to pretend it wasn't part of what they were. Then they talked about other things. His family, a brother in Busan who ran a shipping logistics company, with whom he had the specific careful relationship of 2 men who loved each other and had never found a natural way to say so. Her work before Seoul, the years in Atlanta and New York, and the stint in London that had taught her how cities worked in ways that architecture school hadn't fully prepared her for. They talked about what they were bad at. She was bad at stopping work when she should stop working. He was bad at trusting people's stated reasons for things. She was working on the first. He said he thought he'd always be somewhat bad at the second, which was probably fine. They talked for 3 hours. At the end of the dinner, on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, with the spring air moving warm around them and the Mapo streets doing their ordinary Friday evening commerce, He said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "Not tonight." She looked at him. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, "but I want to ask it when the project is further along, when more time has passed, when you're not in the middle of 14 things at once, and I'm not in a position where the answer might be shaped by circumstance rather than by what you actually want." She thought about this, about a man who understood the difference between the right answer and the answer shaped by the situation, and who was willing to wait for the gap between those two things to close before asking. "That's an unusual choice," she said. "I'm a patient person when something matters," he said. She looked at him in the Mapo streetlight with the city moving around them, and she thought about what she had lost and what she had built, and what she was still building and what she was still becoming. She thought about the specific quality of time since the gala, how it had compressed and expanded and moved through her like something physical, leaving marks she was still finding. "All right," she said, "when you're ready." He walked her to her cab. He did not try to extend the evening. He said goodnight, and she said goodnight, and she got into the cab, and the city moved around her on the way home, and she sat in the back seat with her grandmother's bracelet warm on her wrist and the spring air coming in through the window she'd cracked, because she still, after all these years, preferred the real air to the circulated kind. The Han River Waterfront Revitalization Project, Phase 1, opened to the public 18 months after the groundbreaking, on a Saturday morning in September, when the air had that specific quality of the turn toward autumn that makes everything look slightly more serious and slightly more beautiful than it does in summer. There was a ceremony. Zarya had let Minseo plan most of it, because Minseo was 27 now, and had opinions about how a ceremony should run that were specific and competent and largely correct. And because Zarya had spent 18 months with her attention on the actual building of the thing and was content to let someone else manage the ribbon. The ribbon was cut by Kim Bok-soon. Zarya had asked her specifically, and Mrs. Kim had said yes with the particular gravity of a woman who understood she was being asked not as a symbolic gesture, but as a genuine acknowledgement. She wore her good coat, and her granddaughter stood beside her, and the folder of meeting notes was at home. She had put it away the week prior, she'd told Zarya, because the building was done, and the folder had served its purpose, and some things are for the keeping, and some things are for the letting go. Zarya stood at the edge of the plaza, the northwest corner, where the community space opened onto the Riverwalk, the paving stones arranged the way she had arranged them in drawings 2.5 years ago. The lighting installed exactly as she had specified, because she had argued with the contractor for 3 days about the height and angle of the fixtures, until he had said, slightly exasperated, "Fine, we'll do it your way." And her way had been right. The plaza was full of people, not formally, not arranged, not curated. Just people who had walked in from the neighborhood on a Saturday morning because there was a new thing open along the river. And new things along the river were worth a look. Families with children. Elderly couples moving slowly along the river walk path. Teenagers sitting on the low wall she'd designed with teenagers specifically in mind, the height calibrated for sitting rather than just for looking at. A man selling coffee from a cart she recognized as one of the small local vendors she'd specifically designated space for in the ground floor commercial area of the third tower. A child ran across the plaza and stopped at the edge of the fountain feature. Not a grand fountain, just a shallow waiting basin with a gentle water movement that made sound without demanding attention, and looked at the water with the complete absorption of a child encountering something new. Zarya watched him. She thought about Mrs. O, who had asked about the lighting. She thought about the grandmother who had grabbed her arm in the community center and asked about a place for her grandson to play. She thought, there it is. Do-hyun appeared beside her. He had been there for the ceremony, back of the crowd, as was his preference. And now he was beside her in the place she'd chosen to stand, watching the plaza fill with its first ordinary Saturday of use. "It's what you drew," he said. "More or less," she said. "The drainage on the northwest corner took some adaptation. It looks exactly like what you drew." She looked at the paving and the lighting and the water basin and the people moving through the space the way people move through spaces that have been designed for them rather than for the photograph of the opening ceremony. "Yeah," she said, "it does." They stood together for a while without speaking, which was something she had come to understand was not an absence with him, but a presence. The specific comfort of two people who did not require sound to fill every space between them. Then he said, "I'd like to ask that thing now." She looked at him. "If that's all right," he said. She turned to face him fully. He was looking at her with the expression she had catalogued over the past year and a half. The real one. The unmanaged version that emerged when he wasn't thinking about what his face was doing, which happened more often around her now than it had in the early months. "It's all right," she said. "I want to ask if you'd be willing to build something with me," he said. "Not a project, not a partnership. Something that isn't work, that doesn't have a contract or an equity structure or a dispute resolution clause." He paused. Not for effect. He genuinely seemed to be choosing the words carefully. "I want to ask if you'd be willing to try." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had learned about herself in the past 2 years. She thought about the difference between the woman who had stood at a wall in a ballroom performing stillness and the woman standing here now, in the plaza she had built, wearing her grandmother's bracelet, knowing exactly how much she was worth, and requiring no one else to tell her. She thought about patience, about a man who had waited 18 months to ask a question in order to ask it right. She thought about her grandmother's hands and the word evidence. She thought, "I am still becoming whoever I am going to be. And I would like to find out who that is standing beside someone who does not require me to be smaller to make him feel larger." "Yes," she said, "I'm willing to try." Something in his face settled, not relief. It was quieter than relief. The particular stillness of someone who has wanted something carefully and has just been told it might be possible. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. The plaza moved around them. The child at the fountain had been joined by 2 others. The coffee cart vendor called out something to a passing customer, and they laughed. The river was south of them, going about its ancient, indifferent business, and the city was in every direction, and the morning was the kind of morning that does not announce itself as significant, but that certain people, years later, remember with a specificity that surprises them. The temperature of the air, the sound of water in a fountain, the exact light of a Saturday in September in a city that had, despite everything, continued to be worth building in. Zaria Brooks stood in the plaza she had built from the ground up, in the coat with the pull at the left cuff, with her grandmother's bracelet on her wrist, and her name on the project, and her work visible in every paving stone and every light fixture and every carefully considered inch of space around her. She had not won by marrying a more powerful man. She had not won by destroying the man who had tried to erase her. She had won, if winning was even the right word, and she was increasingly unsure it was, by refusing to disappear, by keeping the records and making the registrations and going back to the community center, even when she was exhausted, and filing the complaint and standing on the courthouse steps and telling the truth about her work in front of cameras, with her handwriting visible in the margins of the drawings she was holding. By doing the work, by making the thing, by insisting, over and over and in every available way, that her name went on what she built. The rest of it, the verdict, the sentence, the dissolution of an empire built partly on her labor, that was justice administered by institutions that existed for exactly that purpose, and she was glad for it, and she had contributed to it, and it was not hers to carry any further than that. What was hers was here. This plaza, these lights. The slightly complicated Northwest drainage solution that nobody would ever know about or care about. But that was correct. That was done right. That would function properly for the 40 years this building was designed to stand. She looked at it all. She let herself feel, without managing it or measuring it or performing it for anyone including herself, the full weight of what it meant to have built something real. It was a lot. It was enough. The September morning continued. The city held. The river moved south toward the sea, the way it always had, carrying everything the city gave it and returning nothing, which was not cruelty but simply the nature of moving water. It goes where it goes, and what you build on its banks is your own business, your own responsibility, your own monument to the fact that you were here and you made something and it stood.